Hello everyone, good evening, welcome to the Kosciuszko Foundation. My name is Ewa Zadworna, I'm Vice President and Director of Cultural Affairs here at the Foundation. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you all here at the Kosciuszko Foundation's house for the lecture Jan Matejko, Painting, History, Modernity. I am pleased to welcome our distinguished guest speaker, the director of the Polish National Museum in Kraków, Professor Andrzej Szczerski. And also I would like to recognize the presence of distinguished guests and the representatives of diplomatic missions, including Poland's ambassador to the UN, Dr. Kosciuszko Szczerski. Welcome. Matejko was born in Kraków. There he spent most of his life. There he died, and there he rests. And it is thanks to the initiative of the National Museum in Kraków that the Senate of the Republic of Poland declared 2023 the year of Jan Matejko, marking this way the 185th anniversary of the artist's birth, the 130th anniversary of the artist's death, and the 125th anniversary of the founding of the Jan Matejko House in Kraków, which is the museum dedicated to the artist. Today's event also refers and marks Polish Heritage Days, which are celebrated each May. And this event is co-presented with the Polish Cultural Institute New York. And with that, I'd like to introduce and give the floor to the Institute's acting director, Maja Styczkowska, to deliver her remarks and also to introduce our guest speaker. Thank you all very much.
Good evening. Firstly, I would like to express my gratitude to the Kosciuszko Foundation for co-organizing the lecture today with us, with the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. And secondly, I would like to introduce our honorable guest, Professor Andrzej Szczerski. Just to give you a quick, brief bio of the professor. He completed his studies in art history at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, where he later obtained his doctoral and post-doctoral degrees. In 2016 to 2018, he was Deputy Director for Scientific Affairs at the National Museum in Krakow. And from 2009 to 2017, he was the President of the Polish section of the International Association of Art Critics. He's the curator of exhibitions in Poland and abroad, including Symbolism, Poland and Britain at Tate Britain in London in 2009. Also an exhibition #Heritage at the National Museum in Krakow in 2017. And he was the co-author of the exhibition Young Poland, the Polish Art and Crafts Movement 1819 to 1918 at the William Morris Gallery in London, which was opened in 2021. What is more, he was the originator and co-curator of the exhibition series 4 Times Modernity at the National Museum in Krakow, of course. And just to add something on a personal note, it's an information I have received from the professor today, is that his interest in art started in secondary school when he received a book from his grandfather about no one other but Matejko himself. And this is how it all started, and now we'll listen more about Matejko from the professor himself. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Welcome to the lecture, but let me first start with my greatest thanks and gratitude to Kosciuszko Foundation and to Polish Cultural Institute New York for inviting me to this prestigious place. I don't want to say that I knew about this place when I was in secondary school, just like I knew about Matejko, but ever since I learned about this place, it was one of my personal dreams to be part of the Kosciuszko Foundation history, so I'm extremely proud and happy to be here tonight, and many, many thanks for all who helped me to achieve this. And I just hope that my talk will be will stand the challenge to be part of the Kosciuszko Foundation activities. Let me first start with this image that represents precisely the moment of voting in the Senate of the Republic of Poland, so the upper chamber of our parliament, last November, when the Senate decided that this year will be the year of Jan Matejko. In Poland, it's a very prestigious act that the parliament dedicates a particular year to a particular patron. And at the initiative of our museum, precisely Jan Matejko was voted in. I took this photo sitting in the chamber, looking at the results, and believe it or not, no one was against the idea. So that's a good sign of parliamentary agreement. But it was actually quite an important symbol of how Matejko unites people, and it's important to every Pole, regardless of any other things that they have in mind or in heart. And it somehow stands for the importance of this figure today. But what is even more interesting is the fact that Matejko is so obviously important artist that, like sometimes happens to monuments, once you put a monument, you forget to whom it is dedicated because it's already there. Just like with Matejko, we thought that it's important to have this year to rediscover Matejko, to look at him with new eyes, look at him from perspective of today. And as you will see, this was also the aim of the exhibition that we are planning to open in less than a month in Kraków, in our museum, dedicated to this new reading of Jan Matejko. So the year of Jan Matejko is intended to be the start of the kind of new research and new discovery of his art, despite it being obviously known and somehow cliched to some extent. I would also like to say that Matejko has been for the many years seen as an obvious figure, but also a figure from the past, figure of the 19th century, the time of his life. And we would like to present him as a painter who speaks through his art about important things that are really important for us today. So let's start the journey into the past, but precisely to understand the current situation and the future from the perspective of 19th century painter. Okay, so let's first meet the man. I think we can turn off the lights, some of the lights, so you will see the images a bit better. On the left-hand side, this is a photo of Matejko when he was 27 in 1865. He was born in 1838 in Kraków. This is the moment when he starts to achieve a professional recognition. He has a year before received a prestigious award in the Paris Universal Exhibition. He got a Grand Prix for showing one of his paintings. You will see it in a minute. He just got married. He's in the beginning of his illustrious career. He is photographed as a young professional, upcoming star, so to say, of painting, not just on the local scale, but also internationally. But this kind of obvious figure has a very unusual biography. He was not even born into a Polish family. His father was a Czech music teacher who moved to Kraków, who in his lifetime was already part of Austria. We have to remember Matejko was born in early 19th century, 1838, when Poland is no longer on the political map of Europe, and Kraków, where he was born, is part of Austria, Austria-Hungary, after 1867. And it was quite common for Austrians or Czechs to move to Kraków as, for instance, teachers or clerks. There was a way to also govern the city, to give a prominent position not just to Poles by Austrians. So that was also the way that this Czech musician came to Kraków. And this is where he met Matejko's mother, who was German. She moved at the end of 18th century, and she was from a family of settlers. She was of the merchant class of Kraków. They probably first started to speak in German, imagine, and the father of Matejko, until the end of his life, never properly learned Polish. Nevertheless, they educated this Polish patriot, and they became both, his family, both mother and father, a very ardent Polish patriots. This is one of these paradoxes of the period of partitions. in many instances, especially in Austro-Hungary, Austrian-Hungarian part of divided Poland, that a number of the oppressors, so to say, who came to, especially to Kraków or to Lviv, they became Polonized in one generation, or even within the same generation. So that was the case of Matejko, Matejko's family. That also explains his fascination with Polish history, because it was also his almost a personal choice to be Polish and to represent what fascinated him about Polish history, to which he somehow subscribed to. Mid-19th century is the moment, mid-1860s, is the moment then there's a famous definition of nation coined by French historian Ernest Renan, who says that nations are created by the rational, conscious choice of spirit. That you are inborn into a nation once you accept the culture. That nation is a spiritual entity to which you can belong if you decide to. And Matejko would be a great example of this idea of becoming Polish by his own will. So he is, in this respect, also himself a symbol of the great attractiveness of Polish heritage that he himself represented. The family was quite well-to-do, but not extremely rich. They had 11 children. Matejko was one of them. The mother died when he was already only 7 years old. So he was basically raised up by his father and his family, and family of mother. As a young teenager, he already showed extremely great talent for drawing, and he was inscribed into School of Fine Arts in Kraków. And this is where he had his first education in the late 1850s. Then he traveled shortly and studied in Munich for a few months, and then in Vienna, which he didn't like very much, and he returned to Kraków. And from 1860s, he started to paint independently, and as I said, in 1864, having his great first success, the Golden Medal at the Universal Exhibition in Paris. Being very brief, his career in Kraków, sort of well established, you would say, elite of the town, is signified by the fact that he becomes the director of the School of Fine Arts in Kraków in 1873. He is receiving international recognition, being part of following his successes, especially in the Universal Exhibitions in Paris, 1864, I mentioned, 1867, and later also having international recognition abroad. He is member of academies of fine arts in Paris, in Berlin, in Prague, in Vienna, and even in Urbino. He receives the Légion d'honneur from the French government in 1870. He's becoming kind of public figure. He is one of the co-founders of our National Museum in 1879. He's having a very decent life with earning money with his paintings, not being extremely rich because he was very generous, but still having a kind of good middle-class life with his wife, Teodora Giebłutowska. Nevertheless, they have 5 children. They live well, although he's so much dedicated to his work and his commitment to extreme creativity. He dies very young, being just 55, and that's also part of the story. He was in feeble health, and he worked to a great extent, and this is how also affected his health. He left us with over 300 paintings and hundreds of drawings of highest quality. One of the paintings obviously is here. It's the only example in the United States, as far as I know, of the oil. And most of them are in Polish collections, but not only. This immense creativity, as you will see, these paintings were not of this size, but the size of this wall, some of them, is how Matejko is most remembered. But if I especially put these 2 images next to one another, because on the left-hand side you have this illustrious artist having a very good career, but on the right-hand side you have his doppelganger, you have his second image, second face. This is his self-portrait disguised as a court jester, Stańczyk in Polish, painted in about the same time, 1862. You may be familiar that in historic Europe, historic courts, royal courts, there was always a jester in the court, so there was this wise fool. The part of the court that could be just amusing, grotesque figure, but he was the one that was able to say the truth in face of the king even if it was a bitter truth, to basically speak out for the things that were hidden, because he was just an artist, he was just a jester. And this is what Matejko is doing with his painting. That's why he presented himself precisely in this costume, because he wanted to say the truth about the past, he wanted to interpret it, even if it was a painful or difficult past, and he wanted this to be a message for the contemporary public. So, on the one hand, you have an average, well-to-do artist. On the other hand, you have agent provocateur. You have the one who is going to steer the life with his painting, and this is how he wanted to be seen. In fact, this image represents the jester not in a typical pose of just being a funny person, but this is an already melancholic jester, deep in his thoughts. He's representing this figure, a historic figure, in an imaginary scene in 1514, when there is a royal ball at the back, you'll see on the right-hand side, and everyone is just amusing themselves. And on the left-hand side on the table, you see a letter informing about the lost border battle between Poland and the Principal of Muscovy around the city of Smolensk. So the Poland is losing Smolensk, and this is the beginning of the collapse of the eastern border of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and only somehow the gesture understands the tragicness of the situation. No one else. They're just having fun. So this is the moment an artist presents himself as the one who sees the future. And I think this is what Matejko was always part of in his paintings. That's the role he wanted to play. What makes him so incredibly important is also not only this philosophical attitude to history and its representation, but also the fact that he already in his lifetime was regarded as a national figure, an artist who could speak to the divided nation, divided by the partitions into non-existing country, and to revive its history and strengthen its spirit. This is very rare in Europe at this stage. We have a lot of this, what Germans call Fürstenmaler, or the prince painters, princely painters, artists who are great figures, who have great houses. They become public figures in Vienna, in Berlin, in France, in England, in the United States, not to such an extent as in Europe. But no one really has this political impact as Matejko. No one really organizes the public, the imagination of the hundreds of people around himself, almost like a national spirit. And that's just two examples of how Matejko was regarded highly in his lifetime. On the left-hand side is a tribute of Poles in America in 1883 to celebrate the 25 years of Matejko's work as an artist. Hundreds of these signatures were gathered especially in Chicago, but also here in New York, and then sent to Kraków in recognition of Matejko's impact also on the imagination of those who were already in Polish diaspora abroad. And on the right-hand side, that's even more spectacular fact. In 1878, Matejko received from the local government in the city of Kraków, where he was born, and he lived, the scepter of Inter Rex. Let me show you exactly. This is like a royal scepter, in recognition of his rule over Polish hearts and minds. And the word Inter Rex is quite important here, because it means in between kings. And that was a historic, legally inscribed into constitution of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth figure that was ruling between two elections. Poles elected their kings. So before death of the king, there was no long live the king, already the new one. You had to wait a certain amount of time before the new king was elected. And in between, usually the primate of the Catholic Church was this interrex. So he was capable of governing the country to some extent between the kings. And this is how Matejko was seen in 19th century. We don't have a Polish king, there is no Polish state, but you are now our king. You are now ruling us. You are ruling our hearts and minds and our spirits before we regain independence. No one ever, and no other artist in whole Europe and whole world at this stage received a similar recognition, and that also shows how politically how challenging was Matejko's painting, and how important is for his contemporaries, and not only for his contemporaries. Until today, you have it's like almost a complete branch of studies in sociology, anthropology, how Matejko work is received today in Poland. You have classes around Matejko paintings in schools. He's in every history book. Some of the scenes from Polish history are seen through his eyes. For instance, he painted a series of portraits of Polish kings. And everyone in Poland thinks we know how the kings in the Middle Ages looked like. Of course, it's a pure fiction, but we almost feel like we know the face of 14th century Casimir the Great, right? On the right-hand side, you have the living images. People organize sometimes these kind of parties about Polish history when they dress like people in the Matejko costumes. You can get different puzzles with Matejko's work. You can, if you have your spare time or your children, you can play with it. There are memes on the internet of Matejko. So that kind of popularity is immense, and everyone would immediately recognize the Matejko painting in itself. They're even part of the official state celebrations. In 2029, when we celebrated 230th anniversary of the Constitution of 3rd of May, it's an important constitution, the first one in Europe, second after American in the world. The heads of states of Poland, the successor states of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and Ukraine met in Warsaw, and they met, as you see, against the huge reproduction of Matejko painting, precisely showing the moment that this bill is passed by the Polish Parliament in 1793. So those things happen also on this level. So knowing all of this, let me show you the actual setup in which Matejko developed this highly influential painting in his lifetime. For him, the political situation, the division of Poland, non-existence of Poland on the map, was the first reference point. But the second was the event in 1863, the uprising against Russia, which took place in especially Russian partition of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but also he, as a young man, he helped with the transfer of arms into the Russian Poland. Kraków was laying on the border between Russian Poland and Austrian Poland, so Matejko was himself involved in the fact. This was the last huge uprising in the mid-19th century, after the 1848 Spring of Nations, when Poles took to the arms to fight for their independence. And the failure of this uprising, represented here as on this image painted by Matejko in 1864, was him a watershed. This was the moment when he realized that on the military ground, Poles will never regain their freedom in his lifetime, but they need to be strengthened by his painting. They need to strengthen their spirit, their cultural identity, so they can regain independence in the future. And he represents here precisely the young woman representing Poland being enchained by the Russian soldiers, and this is the moment when he sees that his art will be the way to break these chains and to speak to the future and hopes for Polish independence. This painting is one of the very few examples, but he painted the scenes of his contemporary times. He then moves back into this apparently safe haven of history to represent things, however, who will speak to the contemporary public and to the future. And Matejko, in his respect, is also the figure of his own times. Namely, the 19th century Europe, mid-19th century Europe is permeated with history, with fascination with history. He is extremely talented as a documentary artist, you would say. As a draftsman, on the left-hand side is a series of drawings he did in 1875 about clothes in Poland to imagine how Poles looked in the Middle Ages until 18th century. And on the right-hand side, he is also an extremely ardent student of whatever historic remains, whether in Polish collections, about the past that he later will recreate or reuse in his own paintings. But what's more interesting, he's also a very well versed in contemporary and modern Europe, especially the techniques of reproductions and techniques of distribution of images that will speak to the public. And that's one of his very rare works, unknown and usually overlooked when you think about the artist. You would always think that he was a history painter. But in 1888 he produced the drawings for the auditorium of the Lviv Polytechnic. They were later on executed, not by him but his followers, that talked about history of the civilization of humanity, and especially about the modern inventions of the epoch. And here is what in his lifetime was seen as the pinnacle of modernity. So the opening of the Suez Canal or invention of the telegraph is actually representing the Europe being connected to America with the telegraph. Actually it happened in 1866. So Matejko in this respect very well understood the logic of his years, the logic of his epoch, and he was extremely successful in using especially the techniques of mass reproductions, that his paintings were available and easily acceptable by a number of people, not those who were able to see the originals, but also through the reproductions which reached wider strata of society, including the Polish diaspora. So with all this in mind, we prepared an exhibition to be opened, as I said, in less than a month from now, Jan Matejko, Painter in History, which will precisely look at Matejko as an agent of modernity. In this respect, that he saw history as a tool to steer the society, to provide the society with the sense of continuity, but also looking in history for the sources of the future revival. So it's not really about the celebratory history painting. It's really a painting that is an agent of change. The exhibition, I just have a few shots how it's going to look like. This is the opening scene. We will present his fascination with history, just like I did before, a minute ago. This is his own collection of different utensils, art objects from the past that he extensively collected and used as props in his paintings. Some of them are of great historic value, some are just certain documents of the past that he wanted to have. But we have to remember that he comes from this 19th century fascination with history, the material aspect of the history. But then we will represent also the way he is using different media in producing paintings, especially the reproductions. He was, for instance, a very keen collector of photography, and he was very much interested in photography as a tool to reproduce his image, not just the graphic art, but precisely he's also using the photo imagery in his own paintings that you will see in a minute. He's also using precisely these photographs to be published on the right-hand side. Some of them to be used in different publications and even distributions. He himself, for instance, paid for photographic reproductions of his paintings to be distributed among school children in Kraków. Then we will be presenting the several major works by Matejko, like here the Sermon of Skarga of Jesuit priest in late 16th century Kraków. This is the painting he got the first golden medal in Paris in 1864, and this is also how the painting would have been exhibited in his lifetime. What you see in front of the painting, these are the explanations of who is in the painting. That text about the represented figures. This is how these paintings were shown to the public. You wouldn't be just encountering the painted beautiful landscape or genre scene or group scene. You would have precisely the text in front of the painting saying who is doing what kind of historical process this figure represents, who is actually the painted figure, right? This was the way that these images were supposed to teach the public about the content. And also one has to understand that this sort of scale of paintings, they really acted like a cinematic screen. We have to remember this before the cinema really makes a big impact on our imagination. So looking at these images would be the effect of the IMAX cinema today, more or less, right? You would buy tickets to enter. you would get this huge wall, specially lit, you would get the inscriptions, and that would be your, so to say, history, but also imagination lesson you get from the artist. And then we will talk about the questions Matejko asked in his paintings about the particular character of Polish civilization, the particular character of Polish historical achievements, because you can always see these paintings as a kind of debate about the conditions of Polish nationhood and Polish identity. So, to move on, this exhibition will precisely show, and let me now get to the precise analysis of several paintings, how Matejko represented history, why was it so influential in his lifetime. This is a case study, so to say, the painting about Stefan Batory, Polish king, 16th century, near Pskov. This is a border between Lithuania and Russia, historically the Principality of Muscovy, where this king, who was actually from Transylvanian Hungarian prince, Stefan Batory, he has defeated the soldiers, the army of Ivan the Terrible, the Russian Tsar, and here there is a tribute of the representatives of the Tsar, who are asking for peace treaty after the series of defeats in the war that took place in 1577-82. Why was it important to paint this scene in 1872? Precisely because Matejko wanted to represent that Poland historically defeated the three partitioning powers and once ruled over them. In this case, it was about defeating Russia. So it was a message to contemporary public that precisely this current state of affairs is not eternal one, and it can be changed because the past looked different. Secondly, he is representing here the whole historical process in this painting. It's not just about the tribute that takes place. You see the Russian nobility kneeling before Polish king, but you would also see just behind the kneeling figure a major Polish army representatives. This is Stefan Żółkiewski, a Polish military leader, and his army at the back. You will find here the Chancellor Zamoyski, who allowed this thing to happen through his very extensive policy. You will see here the representative of the Jesuits and the papal court from Rome that helped to stage this whole affair. These figures never met really, especially in Pskov, but they were presented here as those agents who actually made this thing happen precisely through their actions. And it's also foretelling the future, because Stefan Żółkiewski, this political leader here, presented in this spectacular Polish type of military uniform with winged elements at the back of, they were attached, these kind of wings were attached to the armor at the back. They were supposed to make a strange noise in appearance, and they were supposed to frighten the Polish, frighten the enemy army. So the Polish hussars were known as winged horsemen sometimes. He is the one who in 1610 occupied Moscow, and Poles were ruling Moscow for over 2 years in 1610. So this also shows the aftermath of this war and the Polish success in the wars against Russia. This painting would be precisely, this is just a detail, how these explanations would look like, and they were often done by Matejko himself, where he explains each and every figure, as I said, with his own words and their historical importance. And this painting somehow reappeared recently during President Zelensky's visit to Warsaw, when he visited the royal castle in Warsaw with Polish President Andrzej Duda. And the presidential photographer captured the moment when Zelensky is actually looking at this painting with great fascination. And again, so to say, the third foretelling future scene here is presented, because they are both looking at the moment when the Russian invasion is defeated. so to say, the war against Ukraine finishes in the way with the Ukrainian victory, basically, and this is how this photo was interpreted in Poland. It was one of those extremely popular virals on the web once it was taken accidentally, obviously. So somehow the impact of Matejko images was seen as being revived in a very contemporary situation. It may be interesting to note that Matejko did the same analysis of the historical processes in all his major works. This is another one, Kosciuszko Wrocławice. Just to let you know about the dimensions of it, because that's important. This painting is about bigger than this wall, 465 centimeters times 897. So it's nearly 9 meters width and almost 5 meters high. And this is one of those huge paintings he did, he's most famous for. In this case, he's representing the Kosciuszko, who is the main figure in this place where we are. He is here on the left-hand side. In a victorious battle against Russian soldiers, Russian army during the uprising in 1794, the last uprising before the partitions of Poland, he's actually dressed in American uniform, in American general's uniform, partly to represent his successes in American War of Independence in 1776, where he fought here for American freedom. But what's most important, he's represented here among his soldiers, but they are not professional soldiers, but Polish peasants who actually helped to win the battle. And the main figure here is the peasant leader Bartosz Głowacki, who is looking at Kosciuszko. Their eyes meet somewhere in the middle. And this was the moment when Polish peasants who were serfs really, and they were not seen as citizens, the proper citizens as the gentry in that period of time, were liberated by Kosciuszko after the battle, and he gave the noble status to those who fought with him, and Głowacki was given a nobility status by him. So that was seen by Matejko when he painted this image as the sign of the necessity to liberate Polish peasants. So the previous images I showed, the one I showed you, was really the message for contemporary Poles. You don't have to be afraid about eternal enslavement by Russia. You once defeated Russia, you can do it again in the future. In this case, there is a social message in this image. If you want to build a nation, you have to build it from all strata. You have to use also the peasants who were denied at that stage legal rights and citizens' rights. First, they couldn't vote. You have to make them into the political element of the nation. Interestingly enough, he picked up Kosciuszko as a symbol of this necessity to liberate the peasants from the serfdom, because Kosciuszko was already in Poland recognized as the champion of freedom and in whole Europe. You may remember that Kosciuszko here in the United States was one of the champions of the abolishment of slavery of the black Americans, and it should be remembered that he was given money by the American government for his service, and in 1798, before returning to Poland, to Europe, he decided that proceeds from his American estate should be spent on freeing and educating African American slaves. And he actually asked Thomas Jefferson to execute his will, which Jefferson never did actually, and this money was basically lost. But Kosciuszko was seen as the champion of freedom not just on the battlefield, but also in the social terms. So his abolition of slavery in America and abolition of serfdom in Poland somehow coincided. So this was such an important figure also in this respect. So you see that Matejko was also calling for major social reforms, not just strengthening the kind of military spirit with this image. Let's move on. He was also highly critical of the faults of the Polish nobility class in degrading Polish political life at the end of the 18th century, and that was one of another famous paintings to which he received the Golden Prize in Paris in 1867. This is about one of the deputies at the Polish Diet, Polish Parliament at the end of 18th century, where he, with his own body, is trying to prevent the traitors, who are represented here, from entering the room where they're going to sign a treaty with Russia, basically abolishing Polish independence. This man was called Tadeusz Rejtan. He was actually the member of parliament from today's Belarus, from Nowa Hrudek, and he is representing being a champion of freedom. With his own precise life and body, he wanted to stop them from signing a treacherous treaty. And the fact is that Matejko represented here the members of the nobility families who were still ruling in Kraków at the end of 19th century, so it was also a very highly critical of his contemporary society. This painting is also huge. It's about 3 meters times 5 meters. So again, it really organized the imagination of many people by the sheer impact of the visual language. So there's these three aspects of Matejko work. So strengthening of national spirit, obviously, the idea of freedom, also the social freedom that comes with the future revival of Poland, and also the appraisal of individual gestures of stopping the treacherous and somehow self-induced mistakes or treasons that Polish ruling class was committing and led to the calamities and division of Poland at the end of 18th century. There's another aspect of Matejko's work that we want to highlight in the exhibition, which let's move to another field of the impact of his paintings. Namely, I would call him a very modern, forward-looking cultural politician. With his own work, he tried to develop a highly skilled, very complex political message to not just the Polish public, but also international. Few examples, and I don't want to be short on that to move on. First of all, he very carefully selected subjects of his paintings that would have the impact on the contemporary world, and also the place where they were exhibited and by whom they were purchased or given to. This is something quite unique in the history of Polish art. Namely, he painted in 1883 at the anniversary of the Battle of Vienna, 1683, so it's 200 years after. He painted the scene when King John Sobieski, who was the victor of the Battle of Vienna and stopped the Ottoman Turks from entering Central Europe, is sending a letter about his victory to Pope in Rome, saying that he protected Christendom from the Turks. And he's representing here Polish king as the king who defeated Europe. So Poland is a bulwark of Western Christian civilization. And Matejko organized this painting to be actually given to Pope Leo XIII in Rome, to the Vatican, as a political gesture to remember whole Europe, especially the Christianity, about the importance of the Polish past for European identity. And in fact, this painting was received by Pope, and today you can see it in Vatican. Pope loved it, actually, and there's a separate room dedicated to this painting. As you go to the Sistine Chapel, you can't, but you have to see it. It's on your way. So all the crowds in Vatican would go past this painting. It's very poorly explained, unfortunately, but still makes a huge visual impact. And this is actually contemporary reproduction from Vatican museums from 1880s, showing precisely the way that this painting was exhibited, and it says at the bottom, Sobieski after the victory of Vienna. Matejko went himself to give it to Pope in December 1883 in Rome, and was very well received. So he would look for that kind of acts also within the limits of political life of divided Poland, being an Austrian citizen, but because it was about Christianity and because Austrians also took part in this victory, that was okay for Austria, and this painting could have ended in Rome without any problems. Still, it was the message about the Polish impact on this historic Battle of Vienna. By the way, this is one of those few historic battles in the history of Europe that really defined the identity of the continent. And as I said, he got amazing recognition internationally for his works. Just two examples: the diploma from the Paris 1867 and several medals in his name done in Europe in 60s and 70s. He was also extensively, and that's an interesting thing that we want to bring out to attention of our public. He was also collected not just in Poland. We saw it in Vatican, but the interesting thing, he was also popular in Hungary. From 1867, when Hungarians got a share of the rule in Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Hungarian patriots saw him as the champion of the freedom, not just of Poland, and that's the key thing, but also of whole Central Eastern Europe. They saw in his work the representation of the past of this part of the continent that was subdued by the three empires, by the Germans, Austro-Hungarians, and Austrians in respect and Russians. So from 1867 he becomes a very popular figure in Hungary. He travels to Budapest several times, and this painting is bought for the Museum of Fine Arts in 1879. This represents Battle of Varna, when Poles and Hungarians together were fighting against the Ottoman Turks already in late Middle Ages. And on the right-hand side, this is another example, quite unexpected. Namely, he was also bought by a champion of Croatian revival, Bishop Strossmayer, who was building independent Croatian institutions of intellectual life in 1870s, because he saw Matejko as the champion of liberation of Slavic nations of Central Eastern Europe. And this painting was bought by this bishop to be part of the academy, the Croatian Academy of Science that he was building in the city of Zagreb, so the Croatian capital. And these two paintings are still in Budapest and in Zagreb in Croatia. They will be coming to Kraków to our exhibition very soon. He was, because of his Czech origin, he was also extremely open towards the Czech revival, and this is represented in numerous ways in his paintings. Just one of them, 1885. This is the moment when Europe was celebrating anniversary, 1,000 years of activities of these two apostles, Cyril and Methodius. They were sent from Greece into Central Eastern Europe to teach the Slavic people Christianity. And the Roman Catholic Church recognized their service, although they were part of the Greek Orthodox tradition. They were also recognized by the Catholic Church precisely in 1885. And Matejko painted this image representing these two prophets sent from Greece, as I said, to Central Eastern Europe. Their capital was in a place called Velehrad in Moravia, in today's Czech Republic. And he actually organized a pilgrimage from Kraków, being a leader of this pilgrimage, to donate this painting to the church in Velehrad. It's still there, actually, in Czech Republic. And it was also his way to counterbalance the pan-Slavism of Russia, because the Russians at that stage developed a highly influential ideology that whole Slavic nations have to unite around Russian nation and become one huge Slavic empire guided by the Russian leaders. Matejko wanted to say this is not right, that we have to build this partnership within the remnants of the Central Eastern Europe, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the Czechs should be included in this part. So that was that kind of artistic gesture of great emotional and political message that he wanted to convey, and he did it by his own will. We will show the sketch of this painting in Kraków. The original has to stay in Velehrad. It is highly recognized there. But the most important thing he represented always was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and our common past of nations of Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. And I think this is one of the things that we see, especially now, very clearly, that Matejko is not only a painter of the Polish history, but he really is fascinated with the representation of the whole identity of this region that Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth encompassed. And if you look at today's, for instance, Polish response to war in Ukraine, which is wholehearted support of Ukrainian fight, you see it's not just an accidental thing. It's deeply rooted in our cultural and historical imagination and consciousness. Also, Matejko speaks about it in his paintings. And let me go quickly through this. We don't have much time to discuss in details, but some of these paintings stand clearly for this idea of unity of this part of Europe. Union of Lublin, 1869, another one of his greatest paintings that shows the moment when Poles and Lithuanian nobles decided to form a common state in 1569. And he is precisely representing here the members of Polish-Lithuanian elites that strike a historic treaty by the Jagiellonian Lithuanian king on Polish throne that the country will be united together. And then his biggest painting ever painted. This is 10 meters width and height is over 4.5 meters. It's the Battle of Grunwald. It represents the battle in 1410 that Poles, Lithuanians, Belarusians, Ukrainians fought together against the Teutonic Order. At this moment of history, it would be seen as a war against Germany, although it would be oversimplification, historically speaking, but this was seen as the common effort of Central Eastern Europe to withstand the pressure from the Western Germanization. But what's interesting in this battle is that he represented here the common effort of Polish king here, the Lithuanian Duke, Vytautas, and also these soldiers were actually killing the Teutonic Order leader. They are representing the soldiers of Smolensk, so the Belarus. And here is even the famous Czech warrior Jan Žižka, who is also part of this team that fights for common freedom. And I said he painted it also in response to the vicious politics of Germanization under Bismarck after unification of German Reich in 1871. So you could understand this political impact of this fact. But you would think it's just a painting, but believe it or not, that this painting was actually put a price on this during the Second World War. Namely, the Nazi Germany wanted this to be destroyed because it represented this probably so to say, pro-Central Eastern European spirit. And it was hidden for whole years of the Second World War in the city of Lublin, in one of the unexpected places of the city buildings. It was hidden by several brave Poles, and it was actually covered by asphalt, so no one could find it during the war. It was recovered in 1944 at the end. It was in very, very terrible state, but still survived the Second World War, and it was restored afterwards now to its full glory. You can see it in the National Museum in Warsaw. It's quite an incredible story that artworks, paintings can have such a power that totalitarian regimes want to destroy them, right? At all costs. There was even a reward on that. If anyone reported to the occupiers about this painting, you would get 10,000 Deutschmarks, which was quite a high amount of money for that. So there was a real fight for this, and luckily this painting survived the war, and you can see it today, as I said, in full glory in Warsaw. What is especially dear now to us is to realize how many effort Matejko actually put into the Polish-Ukrainian relations. He very much hoped for the future brotherhood of Poland-Lithuania, that's true, and also Poland-Ukraine. For instance, he made it into heroes of his paintings some of the legendary figures of Ukrainian national mythology like Vernichora, Ukrainian folk prophet. On the right-hand side, you see he even designed paintings for iconostasis in Greek Orthodox Ukrainian church in Kraków in 1888. They were actually executed, and you can still see them in Kraków today. And he made a number of gestures towards Ukrainian national revival in Austria, in the section of Ukraine that belonged to Austria. He even, for instance, in 1869, he founded from his own pocket the scholarship for 2 students for the Academy of Fine Arts in Kraków, one Pole and one Ukrainian. He believed very much that this Ukrainian revival can be somehow reconciled with Polish hopes, and he very much hoped for the brotherhood of 2 nations. And I think it is represented also by the fact that he received commissions from Ukrainian church hierarchy, and he received that. This is the result. Still unresearched and somehow forgotten is also fascination, you could even say, with the history of Jews in Poland. That's another thing that somehow was overlooked over the years, and we're gonna show it in the exhibition. Although Matejko is, as I said, it's not really well researched, but we know that he had a Jewish patrons, for instance, that paid for his money. This, especially the one on the left-hand side, was paid by someone called Anton Rapaport, who was a Jewish politician from Galicia in Austria, and he was very pro-Polish. I mean, he wanted again to find this reconciliation between Polish revival and Jewish revival. He thought of himself as a Polish Jew, and he paid for this painting to be painted by Matejko about the reception of Jews in Poland in 1096. This is the moment where Jews are banned from Spain, from France, and they move eastwards. Then they find their home in Poland, in Polin, and they settle for 1,000 years in Poland, right? And the Polish prince, Władysław Herman, receives them and gives them privileges to work in Poland and have their religion to practice, right? So it's quite an important gesture also. 1889 is not an easy moment for the Jewish population, especially in Austria-Hungary, and in Russia it's even worse. Yet Matejko is doing this thing clearly as an important painting. Why is it important? Because he includes this in a series of paintings called History of Civilization in Poland, and he represents the most important facts from the Polish history, and the arrival of Jews in early Middle Ages is seen as one of those defining moments of history of Poland in the past. But what's even more interesting that one of his students is Maurycy Gottlieb in 1860s and 70s, who was he came from a Jewish family in Galicia, from Orthodox Jewish family, but he was one of those who were looking for reconciliation between Poles and Jews. And he wanted to be both Jewish and Polish, and that's the figure that Matejko would very much appreciate. And he was one of his best students, and Matejko educated him very well. And he always said he wanted to be Jewish Matejko, right? And he studied in Kraków shortly, because some anti-Semitic rights stories he had. He moved to Munich and in Vienna, but then returned quite quickly to Kraków. He settled in Kraków. He painted several fantastic paintings. This one, Ahasverus, is in our collection in the National Museum in Kraków. He dies very young, but he's regarded by many Jewish art historians, Israeli art historians, as the founding figure of Jewish modern art. And it comes from Matejko, believe it or not. But this is one of those things that also have to be bear in mind, that the Jewish modern art somehow begins partly, of course, with Matejko. Gottlieb, for instance, used to wear dresses of Polish nobility to say that I'm part of this history too, right? In the same time, most of his paintings are about Jewish subjects and Jewish identity. And to conclude, I'd like to look at a specific painting by Matejko that somehow encompasses all those peculiarities and messages of his art through visual impact. This is the moment, 1889. It's nearly towards the end of Matejko's life. He dies 1893. that he painted this series that I mentioned to you, History of Civilization in Poland, that defines the historic elements of Polish culture from Middle Ages until the end of 18th century. And one of those paintings represents the Krakow University in 15th century and its influence on the life of the country. This one is from 1889. The Krakow University, the foundation of the Krakow University in 14th century is seen as one of those defining moments in Polish history. And the figure on the right-hand side in this painting is Copernicus. And he's pointing towards heaven, looking for the inspirations of where he receives from God to talk about the construction of the universe. And precisely Matejko made Copernicus in one of those essential figures that emerged on the world stage and changed it forever because they were Polish. And I think this is one of this figure, the painting he dedicated to Copernicus, is precisely summarizes why he wanted so much to be Polish, why he wanted to show that Poles created their own civilization in itself, why the Central Eastern Europe, so to say, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and successor states are precisely the value in itself, and they represent the highest importance comparable to any other historical nation in Europe. So Copernicus, the one who changed the understanding of the world, is Polish, and he represents the best of the Polish cultural and national identity. Why so? Let's have a look at the image just very shortly. Because it was painted in 1873 for the anniversary of Copernicus' death, and it represents the moment when Copernicus is actually discovering that that Earth is not at the center of the universe, and that sun moves around it, as we all know. It was painted to celebrate the anniversary of the astronomer, and he showed it first in Vienna, 1873, at the World Exhibition, to make a case that this figure who changed the course of the history was Polish. Before I get to the description, let me just show you how this painting functions now. It was later bought by University of Kraków, where Copernicus studied, and today is in the aula of our university, precisely here exhibited. Conservations conditions are good enough. Matejko was, on a side story, Matejko was also highly critical and highly humorous man with a good sense of humor. This is how he presented himself working on this painting in 1872 among his 5 children and a very grumpy wife. In fact, his marriage wasn't very happy ultimately, and you see, sometimes the obsession with history, you see how can be self-critically interpreted by the artist. Nevertheless, he took it seriously ultimately. We showed this painting, which belongs to the university, 2 years ago in London, National Gallery in London, in an exhibition curated by Chris Riopel in the main building in Trafalgar Square. It caused a kind of a sensation because no one heard about Matejko despite his achievements in the past. It's completely forgotten now. And the painting was seen as the revelation of about the artist who should be counted as one of the most important 19th century painters altogether. And for us it was also a moment to reflect on this painting and to study it once more. So for instance, this is how Matejko wanted it to be reproduced, and he wanted it to reach the public as much as possible. This is how he used photos, right? He produced the postcards with this painting to move around and to reach the hands of as many public as possible. And then to get to analysis, why he made it to look Polish. There are several hints as in each of his paintings, particular one that can be understood by the if you read this text that accompanied the image. For instance, he modeled the face of Copernicus after a scientist, Henri Henrik Levitou, who was of French origin, but in 19th century this family Polonized again, and they became the champions of the fight for freedom in the Russian Poland. In fact, his brother of Henri Levitou, Karol, was a famous insurgent. It was a kind of a hero of his period, a champion of freedom. So Matejko took this face of his brother to stand for Copernicus, and to represent also this history of cultural attractiveness of Poland, but also the insurgent tradition of Poland. In fact, he didn't use the medieval portraits of Copernicus to model for the face of the astronomer. He also took the actual architecture of the place Frombork, where Copernicus was working. This is north of Poland, on the Baltic coast. In fact, in Matejko's lifetime, this was Germany, and it was you had to cross two borders to get there. Today, you can. This is Polish territory, and interestingly enough, it lies on the Laguna of Vistula River. So the Vistula River is a symbol of Polishness. It unites Poland from south to north. So Matejko, painting this particular building with the background representing the Vistula Lagoon, somehow looked at the Polishness of Copernicus, because he did his discovery in Poland. Thirdly, in this painting, you see there are different astronomical tools, especially on the foreground. They came from the museum of the university in Kraków, where Copernicus studied. These instruments are from 17th and 18th century, so long before Copernicus died, long after Copernicus died, but he took them especially as props because he wanted this to be a reminder of Copernicus' pedigree, intellectual pedigree that came from the Kraków University, where he studied, in fact, astronomy. He also studied in Italy, but never mind, he was shown as the student of Polish University. So altogether, these are like the references to his Polishness in the painting. But what's the most important is that he wanted this to be seen as a figure that transgresses the usual 19th century divisions between mind and spirit, and also is a symbol of intellectual audacity. Namely, that Copernicus represented him as a singular figure who changes the history of mankind. He is the powerful figure who, with his own mind and spirit, can completely reshape the world. Where does it come from, this audacity? And here, paradoxically, we have two explanations. One is from history of Polish Romanticism. In early 19th century, Polish Romantic poet Kazimierz Brodziński and others presented Copernicus as a symbol of Polish moral superiority towards the rest of Europe. Namely, the fact that Poland was the only country who tried to fight the Tsarist empire, who tried to fight for freedom, not to accept the division of Europe between empires, was seen as such a unique gesture that can only be compared to the audacity of Copernicus in stopping the historical understanding of the way that the world is organized. So this Polish Romantic poet said that Poland is Copernicus in the world of morality, freedom and brotherhood. So Copernicus functioned as this symbol. But what's very paradoxical, that this understanding of Copernicus as the single figure who can change the course of the world was strengthened by no one else but by Friedrich Nietzsche, a German philosopher and writer, who towards the end of his life announced that he was Polish, actually. Nietzsche said that he despises of his Germanic roots, and he thinks he's from the Polish family of Niecki, and that he was only Germanized, and his idea of superhuman and his idea of opposing the world comes from his Polish roots, right? imagine. And he said that he especially loved the Polish parliamentary tradition of veto, liberum veto. That was the tradition in Polish parliament that one member of parliament would stop the proceedings of the parliamentary diet, saying himself, I don't agree this bill to be passed, liberum veto, and the whole parliament would be dissolved. And Nietzsche said, I am like that. I stop the world from going into the catastrophe, whatever, and this is because I'm Polish. And he precisely said, Copernicus for me is a role model, because Copernicus with his own gesture stopped the course of the history. So you see there are different paradoxical sometimes connections that made Copernicus to feel that the single individual human who can stop the world, who can change the world rather. And but for Matejko, what was even more important than the importance of being against the established cliches, established rules of the universe that is wrong, was that he found in Copernicus precisely the perfect synthesis of mind and religion, fides et ratio. Copernicus, the full title of the painting is Copernicus or the Conversation with God. In fact, paradoxically, in communist Poland, the second part of the title was completely omitted. You read this painting only as Copernicus, right? Because he's not showing Copernicus, who even already in the late 19th century was seen as a symbol of the science, of the rational mind, against Christianity, against religion, the liberation of the Enlightenment, against the so to say closeness of the religious mind. No, he says precisely the opposite. Copernicus, in fact, is kneeling before God in this moment when he represented him, thanking God for allowing him to discover the truth about the universe. This is the moment of communion between the man and God. This is the moment of communion between man's mind and religion and the illumination from above. This is how this can be understood. So his gesture on the left, his right hand, is the hand of a prayer. At his left hand, with the scientific instrument, is the hand of the ratio, is the hand of the scholar, right? And this is precisely what fascinated Matejko so much in Polish culture, that it could combine precisely these two elements that he found to be extremely important. So that you have to combine the spiritual, the religion, with the rational, that you can build the world on the religious foundations, adding the human aspect of the ratio that comes anyway from God's revelation. So on the one hand, this is a man who is very audacious, the man who can change the world. In the same time, he's deeply rooted in the religious tradition and in the power of human mind. And I think this can be understood as his key to understand also the Polish heritage that he wanted so much to represent. And Copernicus was such an important figure because it showed that the world, even if it's established and is seen as obvious, can be changed. That there is the power of changing the world if you combine fides et ratio. And this is what was also expected from Matejko and from his art, I think, that he wanted to strengthen with this painting. So, if you look at the final image, if you look at Matejko in his early 50s, he looks much older in this painting. He is photographed in his studio. He very much loved, as I said, photography. He liked especially this psychological photography. He always posed in a very peculiar way. He would also, his face would be very much by him created for the photo somehow. He would have a special type of eyes to present him as a wise man, to present him as a wise man, to present him as this jester that we saw in the beginning, that has this audacious character, and with his art wants to teach us about things that we always don't even know or we take for granted in other type of the world, but through his eyes, through his painting, he wants to revive our imagination. He wants to present us the importance, the incentiveness for the revival, for the change of the world, just like Copernicus. So I think this is what's fascinating about Matejko, that he knew how to use the modern visual language. He knew how to use most modern paintings of his epoch, to talk about history, to use painting to talk about history as the incentive for understanding the contemporary world and to shape the future. Thank you very much.
On this wonderful journey through Polish history, but also through the history of how Matejko saw it, actually. And I'm afraid to ask my question because it's very banal in light of everything that you presented tonight. But I keep thinking, so here's a man who died in his early 50s. He painted, you said, about 300 pieces we have of his. Did he have a lot of students help him? Like, how did he create actually his work? And also, how did he come to kind of accrue so much knowledge about your own history, about the world, and then kind of rewrite it in a way that it's valuable and important for any other nation around? Maybe you can speak to his life a little bit.
Yes, thank you for this question. He did use help of some of his students. He used to have some help with the major commissions. Yet in the same time, this 300, I mean, they can range from this size or even smaller portraits to the huge ones. Yet he was a workaholic. He was known to work day and night, drinking coffee and smoking. And this is one of the reasons why he ended in 55, his lifetime. It's this kind of technical capacity that he achieved, and with the help of students, especially when he was in the academy, when he had students to help him, that made it possible. By the way, one of his students was this one, Jacek Malczewski, who is here. He was quite strict about the message that he wanted students to convey, but he let them to move away from his own visual language very freely. So even if they helped him, they could go their own way in the future as they wanted. Secondly, he relied for the source of the knowledge. His readership was amazing, but he was among the intellectual elite in Kraków, especially among historians. And his best friend was someone called Józef Szujski, who was a great historian of the epoch. And they are known to talk over and over about Polish history. In fact, Szujski was one of the founders of the political society called the Jesters. So the model of the Jesters also comes from this source. And for instance, the Copernicus painting is modeled after a scene that Szujski describes in his play, theater play about Copernicus that he wrote for 1873. So that was also the resources he used. So I think this explains he was in a very high quality intellectual circles in Kraków, and this is where his knowledge came from. But he did also a lot to study that himself. There were resources available. Kraków in his lifetime was developing institutions of learning, academies, so the resources were easily available and he studied them.
Okay. Ed, please.
Andrzej Szczerski, I want to also thank you for your inspiring lecture. I was thinking throughout the lecture about the word modernity, and you ended with the long section on the figure of artists. Thank you. And how he represents a modernity unlike Nietzsche. Okay. And I was thinking about that partly because I was actually afraid when I came to this lecture that it would be a catalog. That you would say, well, first Matejko painted this, then he painted this, then he painted that. So I love the structure that you gave to it. I guess this is not going to be a question, more like a comment, and just to ask you to respond to this. So I love the fact that you opened with the photograph of Matejko, and that's astonishing. And you said that Matejko was a Pole, or became a Pole by choice. His father was Czech, his mother was German. He could have been anything in the Austrian Empire. So I wonder if that's another way of looking at Matejko's work as an expression of modernity, that becoming a nation, becoming a member of a nation, is a matter of decision, and that those paintings that he, the historical paintings that he produced, were an appeal for the viewers to make that decision.
Thank you very much. This is most illuminating, and I just can only but agree. And I think one of the key issues about the word modernity in context of Matejko is precisely this, that he presents a very modern nation, concept of the nation, precisely based on the individual choice, but also rooted in a deeply historic heritage to which you want to subscribe. And precisely the scholars of nationalism would start the history of modern definition of nation from Renan, from French sociologist and historian. So I think very much so. But in the same time, I also think that Matejko rediscovered the attractiveness of the concept of this concept precisely because he saw the Polish history. That we have a number of examples of that, especially 19th century, but also later on, where people decide on free will to be Polish because they want to. And I think this is one of this modern things about Matejko. In fact, the whole idea to read him in modern context, I think it's pretty new, and I think I was also developed. But I think thank you very much for that, because that strengthens my way of thinking. Thank you.
No, I thank you also. It's a wonderful lecture. I do have a question about Mr. Matejko. Did he not do other work as well besides painting? Did he not do interior decoration? Was he not involved with Kosciuszko and other places? Maybe Ivano did.
Yes, he did design wall paintings in the Mariacki Our Lady Church in Kraków with his students precisely, and a number of helpers. But that was quite unique. He was commissioned to design a decoration of medieval church, which he did in a surprisingly good way. He was not really trained to be a wall painter, but he did it. They're like individual images combined into amazing unity based on medieval patterns. He was also a costume designer, very rarely, but he did. His most important thing is that he designed the wedding dress for his wife, and which unfortunately she destroyed once she had a mental breakdown, but there's a recreation of this dress now. You can see it. It's a beautiful one, and it's like William Morris in England. He also designed the costume wedding dress for his wife at some point. So these things happened. He was also a draftsman, as I said, but otherwise we know that he was interested in photography. We don't have a record of his own photos, but it kind of seems to me that he definitely tried with photos. We have to investigate it too, but that would be kind of really his hobby rather than the actual thing. But his main thing is painting.
Thank you very much. I also sincerely want to thank you for this fascinating journey, and also for providing the political context of these paintings. And a couple of questions. The first one that you mentioned about this certain political controversies. Once you see the important family scenes, their basically ancestors have signed certain acts. And I understand also the historians have been rather critical of some scenes and the romanticization of the history. So how the political debate evolved around that, around these important aspects. And the second probably is more trivial one. How long it would take to create such a specific Grunwald battle for him? I understand that he was working on several paintings at the same time, but it would be also curious. And again, we sincerely thank you for the National Museum, which lent this Grunwald battle for Lithuania at least 15 years ago.
Yes.
And it's created like the religious pilgrimage, and all really were willing to see it. Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe I'll start. By the way, it was the ultimate journey of this painting. It stays now in Warsaw, and so Vilnius was the exception. So starting with the second question, it took about to Grunwald painting, I think about 2 years. He even went to see the battlefield to have a taste of how he can stage the scene. He would normally plan 2 or 3 paintings at the same time, looking for anniversaries. So he would be very conscious in changing the date of the final touch. So he would it's like doing good exhibition, you prepare it 2 or 3 years in advance. So the actual painting would take several months, especially with the help of a team of technical helpers. But the preparatory stages, looking for models, for instance, I showed you, he was looking for particular figures. For instance, for the King Bathory, he was looking for Armenian, because he wanted to have an Oriental, so to say, look, right? So that would be a long process, a kind of a studying process, and the execution would be several months, up to 9-10 months for painting. So that's pretty long. The biggest problem was actually finding a place, because there were huge canvases. He even went to Paris to buy them. He couldn't get them in Kraków or in Vienna, so he had to commission, for instance, the large size of the canvases. So it was a big process, intellectual and technical process. To answer the first question, there was this one painting where he attacked precisely particular families that had descendants in Kraków, the Reitan. It was precisely the result of the discussions within the historian circle, like Józef Szujski, who was responsible for the division of Poland, whose family's faults were they. This was such a row after this painting was exhibited. Even the prize he got in Paris didn't help. And in fact, this was a turning point in Matejko's artistic career, because from that moment on, he ceased to paint that directly critical paintings. He would go into this glorification, so to say, or discussing about Polish past rather than to paint this directly critical images. So he kind of realized that this is not going to work. He would rather speak about the past through the important glorious events with consequences than to paint the largely critical ones. So this was his response. I think it was quite a wise decision, in fact, because he wouldn't be, in that way he wasn't involved in the day-to-day discussions at home, right? He wanted to do something more general, to build common ground. But yes, the debate was so vicious and so critical. He even painted then a quite self-ironic painting. It was called The Condemnation of Matejko. In Middle Ages, Kraków, and there's a clerk speaking that Matejko will be beheaded because of his painting.
I have 2 small questions. Out of hundreds of you recognize, show us the face of Copernicus. That was out of hundreds of faces. How many are recognizable by scholars, or because, and do they appear? In this. In one painting and then in another, and this is fascinating. And he had probably models, right? Or there was just, so this is one question. And are you familiar by any chance with the novel of Maria Jędrys-Borelowska, she's a writer, and she, in her latest book, she used a lot of materials of Matejko's letters to friends and so on and so on. This is just a question.
Thank you. I don't know it. I'll be keen to find out about it. As far for the models, yeah, not hundreds are recognizable, and we know of them, but there are some. For instance, his wife is appearing in many instances of his paintings, usually in the glorious roles as queens and princesses. Yeah, surprising, not really. Secondly, he was a great portrait painter, by the way. He also made quite a good money with his portraits, but also it was a way to represent his contemporary Krakowians. So he, for instance, is using the faces of his models that he painted portraits for historic figures. He also would find particular faces he liked among his friends or students at the academy to paint them, but at the same time a lot was just invented. That was enough for a painterly imagination for him to invent the face. I mean, this is, for instance, purely fictional, the faces here. I mean, these are not really models. And last but not least, he also painted himself several times as a jester, for instance, in some of the paintings. So we could find out. There are stories about him walking through the streets of Kraków and seeing a great face and following the particular chap and saying, well, why don't you model for me? That's a fiction, but possibly it also happened once or twice.
Since you mentioned both Matejko and Gottlieb, my question is, has anybody identified their hand, per se, in any of the paintings? And two, I find it interesting that Gottlieb only painted one, as far as I know, large format painting, Christ in the Temple. And yet Matejko went the other way. Most of his paintings tend to be large format, not as large as Matejko's, but so where does that fit in, the contrast between the two of them?
Yes, nobody identified works of them in Matejko's paintings. That's would be impossible, and I think he wouldn't let them to be so recognizable anyway. We know that we can discover traces of two of his students, Józef Mehofer and Stanisław Wyspiański, in decoration of Mariacki Church. That's we know they did it together, and we even know which parts were done by them. Otherwise, it's not known. I think Gottlieb did. There's one more large canvas by Gottlieb in our collection. It's about rabbis in the temples, kind of religious subject, but it's not really big. And he never got to Matejko.
Is it displayed?
Yes.
Where?
In Sukiennice.
It's not large.
Well, it depends what we talk about, what we think of large. I mean, no one will get close to Matejko. That's true. No one ever painted something similar of that size. I think also people such as Malczewski and Gottlieb, but Gottlieb dies young, so we don't know how he would have developed. But they wouldn't find clients for these huge canvases in this early years of their career. I mean, Gottlieb wouldn't find. I mean, to buy the work of Matejko, there were even national collections around Poles in all partitions to buy out these paintings from Matejko and, for instance, donate it to the National Museum in Kraków. So there's a huge amount of money. I don't think anyone without that fame, such as Matejko, would find any client for that. So this explains partly why they never got there. Secondly, I just don't think they were able to do this. Matejko was unique in the sense that nobody else would be able to stage that kind of huge canvases. Also, they found out, especially Malczewski, he's not really getting to that dimensions. Also, he finds smaller canvases much more appropriate, and Also the way he paints and the subjects he represents, they are much more intimate than Matejko. So in this respect, I think no one really got there because of the conscious choice. Would be quite curious to know what Gottlieb would do, because Gottlieb wanted to be second Matejko. We know that. Malczewski, no, he departed from his teacher quite soon in his lifetime. So it could be even said that he consciously didn't want to get to these sizes because he didn't want to be associated with Matejko. Gottlieb could have been, but his life ended too shortly, and we don't know what would have happened. But at this stage where he was in his lifetime, he wouldn't find clients for that.
I had an eye contact with many people in this room who wanted to ask more questions, but unfortunately someone needs to watch the time, so I think that we need to really conclude this part of this evening. I want to express our big gratitude to Professor Szczerski for delivering such a wonderful and informative and comprehensive lecture and sharing his insights and his knowledge with us. Thank you so much for coming and for taking time out from your very busy schedule, and thanks very much for your great questions. On the last note, the Kosciuszko Foundation, this nearly 100 years old organization, is a membership organization. Therefore, if you are a member, that's fantastic, thank you. If not, you are most welcome to join us as the member. And with that, I would like to conclude this evening, and I invite you downstairs for the wine reception. Thank you all very much.